Chapter 4. Love Don't Come Easy. Leaving Ray was almost as easy as being with him. I often say that we had a great marriage and a great divorce. When the marriage was working, it was working very well. When it wasn't, it was time to go. There was no bitterness or nastiness, it just was time to go. We had such an amiable breakup that Ray drove me around to find an apartment. I guess we had broken up and reconciled so much that when we did it for the last time, we both knew it was for good. I probably wouldn't have even filed for divorce if I hadn't planned on leaving Atlanta. I figured when I decided to leave, I needed to make it a clean break. So I filed for full custody, and Ray didn't put up much of a fight. He didn't realize what had happened until I was actually moving from Atlanta. I was determined to leave, but there was no way I was going to deprive him of seeing his son. I just didn't want him filing abandonment charges against me later, so I had to make it official. I left Atlanta to start a new life. I moved to Chicago partly at the encouragement of Larry Lewis. Outside of our romantic involvement, he showed me how many wonderful opportunities I would have in Chicago. I left Atlanta to pursue some of those. I had dated a couple of people after Ray, but Larry was the first guy I wanted to be serious about. I met him in Atlanta at the Cool Jazz Festival. He was staying with a friend, Sheridan, who was also my friend. Larry told Sheridan that he wanted to meet a nice young lady while he was in Atlanta. I just happened to be over Sheridan's one day. Larry was out, but when he walked in, I was sitting at the kitchen table talking to Sheridan. When Larry and I looked at each other, there were sparks everywhere. I won't say that it was love at first sight, but there was definitely a connection. We talked nonstop that night and the whole week or two he was in Atlanta. Before he left, we were an item. Larry was smooth but honest, laid back but outgoing. He was also very sexy and one of the most fun people I had ever met. It was not hard to leave Atlanta and head to Chicago. I had planned to change jobs, maybe even cities, but I just didn't know where. When all of this happened, I knew it was supposed to unfold that way. I told my friends and family my plan to move to Chicago, and no one discouraged me. I even drove a truck with furniture and everything to Chicago by myself. That was the only time I heard any opposition. Some of my friends didn't want me to make that trip by myself, but since no one volunteered to go with me, I drove those 11 plus hours to Chicago. I found a place to stay and got settled and came back for Kanye, who was staying with his dad while I was there. Ray wasn't happy that I was taking Kanye and moving to Chicago, but he didn't put up much of a fight, not even for joint custody. The divorce was final 2 weeks before I left Atlanta, and I had full custody of Kanye. I was ready to embark on the next phase of our life as a single woman and a single mother. I had just completed my doctorate in English education. I was young, black, and smart. I could write my own ticket. Before I moved, Larry cut out the yellow pages of the phone book with all the colleges and universities listed and sent me the classifieds from two local newspapers. He had circled things he thought I'd be interested in. I applied to Chicago State and Roosevelt University. I landed both positions. I accepted the one at Chicago State because I wanted to teach in a predominantly black school. I was all set. Larry Lewis wasn't the primary reason for this change, and I didn't move to Chicago because of any promises we had made to each other. I wasn't delusional about our relationship, and quite frankly, I wasn't looking to necessarily get into another serious relationship so soon after my divorce. But I did love Larry. I enjoyed his company, and I needed a change of scenery, so the Windy City suited me just fine. Larry and I didn't stay together very long. I met him in June, moved to Chicago in late August, went back for Kanye in late September, and 4 or 5 months later, Larry and I were history. I only remember when we broke up because by that Valentine's Day, we were no longer an item, although we remain friends to this day. Kanye was only 3 years old, And thank goodness he and Larry never had the time to really bond. I think one of the worst things you can do to your children is have them get close to people, men, and then have those people disappear. It causes a lot of confusion. That's why I was always careful about the men in my life and who I decided to have around my son. It's not easy being a single woman with a child. You have needs and desires. You want to date and enjoy the company of the opposite sex because, after all, you're human. But your child must come first. You cannot have a revolving door of uncles and friends coming in and out of your child's life. I always considered this before I dated any man. Like with Larry, I had options. Ray kept Kanye until I got settled. And after we moved to Chicago, Kanye would spend his summers with Ray and Ray's parents. I had my summers to explore the dating scene, and those 3 months gave me enough time to know whether a man was worthy of sticking around beyond August, worthy of meeting my son. A couple of men were worthy. Ulysses Buckley Blankley Jr., or Bucky, was one. I thought he was going to be my last love. He and I had a great relationship. Kanye liked him a lot. He would take Kanye to the park for hours near his apartment building in Evanston. Kanye used to call that park Bucky's Park. We lived with him for a few months after I returned from India, and we were even going to buy a house together on South Shore Drive, but I think Bucky got cold feet. That house was supposed to be our house. We were to move in there as a family, but Love didn't live there anymore. Things had changed between Bucky and me, and I could feel it. He never said anything. We didn't have a big blowout argument or anything. He didn't treat Kanye any differently. Things were just different between us. The love didn't feel the same. I was torn at the same time. I really wanted that house and I couldn't afford it by myself. But there was no way I could see myself staying with a man because I thought I needed him or putting Bucky into a situation that I knew he didn't want. I believe he would have moved into that house with me had I pressed the issue. But I wasn't going to press the issue. I had to do something. But I really didn't know what to do. One day I got on the bus, and what should I see in the seat I was about to take? A sign that read, "Ban the buck." The Chicago Transit Authority was requiring all passengers to use correct change. Back then, a bus ride was only a quarter. There were ads everywhere to ban the buck. I thought it was a sign for me to kick Bucky to the curb. I had prayed for a sign, but I never imagined God would take me so literally. It was time for me to ban the buck. I didn't think Bucky minded at all. Actually, I think he was relieved. He was not the kind of man who would have wanted to bail out of a relationship. He was a kind, loving, generous, responsible man. But it was time to move on. After Bucky, there was Tony. Kanye actually hooked me up with him. I was taking Kanye voting with me at our local place. I saw this handsome man. He was tall, 6'4". I am all of 5'4". Before we voted, Kanye tugged on me to check this guy out. I already had. We went in to vote. I always took Kanye in the booth with me because I wanted to expose him to the process. When we were finished, the man was gone. I decided to walk up the street a bit. They were building some townhouses there, and they had a few models open. Who would we bump into there? The man from the voting facility. I wasn't the kind of woman to ever make a move, so I just went about my business looking at the models. When I finished, I started to head home. Tony, being a man, wanted to check out the garages. Kanye saw an opportunity. Grabbing me by the hand, Kanye pulled me in Tony's direction. "Mom, he went that way," Kanye said. I was so amused. Here was this little 6-year-old trying to hook me up. Kanye wanted me to have somebody. I think he never wanted me to be alone. I don't know what it was about Tony that caught Kanye's eye, but he was being rather insistent that we go in Tony's direction. I kept heading toward home, though, not interested in seeing the garages. But Kanye carried on, wanting me to follow this man. Tony ended up catching up to us, and we struck up a conversation. Kanye stood there just as nice as he could be. It was as though he was saying, I'm a good boy. See? No trouble at all. Any other time, Kanye would have been ready to go. Fidgety, fidgety, in fact. But he waited patiently. Tony asked for my number, but I told him I'd take his instead. Rarely, if ever, would I give my number to a man. I called Tony a week later, and we ended up dating for a couple of years. Kanye liked Tony. He especially liked that Tony rode motorcycles. Kanye was so small then, I dared not let him ride on the back with Tony, but it was a good relationship while it lasted. Scotty was the closest I came to actually marrying again. Kanye called him my almost stepdad. I met Scotty at my going away party in my backyard. Kanye and I were leaving for China for a year, and Scotty tagged along with my best friend, who lived in his building. He had locked himself out of the apartment that evening. She saw him in the lobby and invited him to come with her to my party. Nothing really got started then. We talked a little bit, but I didn't make much of it. But I heard that he asked about me for the entire year I was in China. I guess I made an impression, huh? When we got back, Scotty asked me out. After the first date, it was on. We were together for 6 years. What impressed me was that he was an old fashioned gentleman, meaning he knew how to make a woman feel like a lady. He was a sharp dresser, interesting to talk to, and very progressive minded. And he was a whole lot of fun. He was an auto mechanic teacher at a high school and was involved in lots of activities through the teachers' union. But I really liked that the students he taught were all very fond of him. They loved him dearly. Some of the boys would come up to him during football games or wherever we were, just to speak to him. Some who had graduated still made it a point to come and pay their respects to Mr. Willie Scott. We lived together for a few years, but our relationship ended primarily over a dispute over how I should raise Kanye. Some of his old-fashioned, stern school teacher ways just weren't congruent with the way I wanted to raise my son. I did respect, however, Scotty's point of view and never interfered, at least not openly, with the way he disciplined Kanye. I wanted that strong male influence for Kanye on a daily basis, but Scotty seemed more interested in punishment than discipline in exchange. I always believed that children aren't these silent slaves who should be seen and not heard, who should obey and nothing more. I believe that you should communicate with your child, and that if you're a good parent, your child will obey you because he respects you, not because he's afraid of you. Scotty was from the fear and awe school of parenting. He was one to focus more on taking away things and privileges. For example, if Kanye hadn't cleaned the tub well enough or mopped the kitchen floor to Scotty's satisfaction. While that kind of parenting has its place, I was more interested in nurturing the creative side of Kanye, making sure that he was widely exposed and even heavily indulged. Scotty felt that I was too lenient. Scotty would say the few times I came to Kanye's defense about a chore left undone, "You're going to fuck him up." Scotty thought I was spoiling Kanye, ruining him by letting him get away with any one small thing. I learned later that his military stance was, in fact, good for Kanye. But still, enough was enough. The breaking point for us came the day there was a piece of paper on the lawn. It was Kanye's job to keep the lawn free of debris, and somehow a piece of paper ended up on the lawn. Scotty lost it. I believe he overreacted. It was one thing to discipline a child, it was quite another to be overbearing. I knew then it was time to go. Kanye and Scotty had their share of run ins by this time, and I felt Kanye was growing unhappy being around him. I had caught Kanye sitting at the dining room table almost in tears. He and Scotty weren't getting along that day. I asked him what was wrong. "If you love him, Mom, stay with him," Kanye said. "I'll be out of the house one day." "But what will you do now?" I asked Kanye. "I guess I'll just go live with my dad," he said, wiping the tears from his eyes. That was it. Kanye never cried, and I knew he didn't want to live with his dad. He was content just staying with him for the summers. But for good, that's not what he wanted. If I believed that Kanye truly preferred to live with his dad, I would have been devastated. But I would have let him go. But he was only asking to leave because he was unhappy living with Scotty. There was no way in hell I was going to send Kanye off to stay with his dad just so that Scotty and I could be together. What Kanye says in the song is true. I never put no man over him, and I wasn't about to start then. Not long after that day, Kanye sat at the table teary-eyed. I took my child and moved out. I still loved Scotty, but love was not enough. Not enough to make my child unhappy. I'm glad I went through those loves and exposed Kanye to all of it, the good, the bad, and the ugly. There were some lessons there for him too. One of them was that love doesn't come easy. When you know that truth, perhaps you're more apt to treasure it. When you find it, and you're less likely to jump into a relationship without thought and care. My greatest love, though, which outweighed any love I could have for any man, was for my child. Women must realize that their first responsibility, their first consideration must be for their children. Too many women put a man before their child, and that's wrong. Men come and go, but your children will be your children forever. One thing your child must know is that he is loved above all else. You give him security and confidence when you let him know that no matter what, he will always be loved. That doesn't mean that you stop your life. That doesn't mean that you live like a nun. That doesn't mean that you aren't tough and that you don't discipline your child and even punish him when necessary. What it means is that you love him unconditionally and you let him know that the love you have will never fade. The love for your child is not like a love for any man. That may fade at any time. This love is eternal. And that's what I let Kanye know, that my love for him was unconditional and eternal.